Share the love for comics from the Philippines to the rest of the world. Enjoy 24 curated webinars and comics masterclasses throughout all weekends of September. Nurture your creativity at PICOF 2022. The Philippine International Comics Online Festival is organized by Comicet and supported by the National Book Development Board Philippines, National Commission for Culture and the Arts, Department of Information and Communications Technology or DICT, Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines, IPOPHIL, Bureau of Copyright and Related Rights, Wacom Philippines, and Kumu. Welcome to the Philippine International Comics Online Festival 2022. Please settle down. The stream will begin soon. Thank you. On all weekends of September, enjoy all 24 PICOF 2022 curated webinars, workshops, and more. Share the love for comics from the Philippines to the rest of the world. Stay present. Let's enjoy the session and avoid multitasking. Save your questions for the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. And don't forget to be respectful in the comments and share the live stream. We are about to begin in 5 minutes. Thank you and enjoy the festival. Share the love for comics from the Philippines to the rest of the world. Enjoy 24 curated webinars and comics masterclasses throughout all weekends of September. Nurture your creativity at PICOF 2022. The Philippine International Comics Online Festival is organized by Comicet and supported by the National Book Development Board Philippines, National Commission for Culture and the Arts, Department of Information and Communications Technology or DICT, Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines, IPOPHIL, Bureau of Copyright and Related Rights, Wacom Philippines, and Kumu. Please.
Good morning, everyone, from the Philippines to the rest of the world, and welcome to the Philippine International Comics Online Festival 2022. Now in our third year, we're reaching out to creators from all over the world. In today's webinar, J.H. Williams from Sandman Overture, Promethea, Echolands joins Duy Tano of the Comics Cube to talk about his unique mix of styles and how he puts them together in order to tell stories ranging from Gotham City to The Dreaming. J.H. Williams III has had a long career in illustration and writing as a multiple award-winning creator for many works, such as Promethea, The Sandman Overture, Batwoman, Batman and Desolation Jones. J.H. also has done various projects outside of the comics world, like working with iconic rock bands Blondie and The Sword, among others, and has been involved in other creative media projects, too many to mention here. His current project is the groundbreaking Echolands for Image Comics. Duy Tano, our moderator, talks to comics writers, artists, editors, and more on the Comics Cube, where he delves into the history of comics and the creative process. Duy loves all sorts of comics, and that is reflected in the people he has interviewed, from Jeff Smith, Dave Gibbons, Brian Bolland, Stefati, Reunion on Webtoon, Craig Thomas from Blankets, and Dana Simpson, Phoebe and our Unicorn. Please welcome Duy Tano and J.H. Williams to the panel.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you, Cam.
Hello.
All right. I will hand them off to you now. Okay.
That was quite an introduction. Thank you.
Yeah, it was great.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for your presence today here on the Philippine International Comics Festival. I'm Duy Tano of the Comics Cube. I am joined by J.H. Williams III, currently
Hello, everyone.
the co-writer artist of Echolands, coming out from Image Comics. How are you?
Good. How are you?
So I'm doing good, but what people might be unfamiliar with is the fact that you and I actually do speak quite a bit. So
Yeah.
So that is up on my
quite very much.
Thank you. And that is up on my channel, the Comics Cube, which you guys can go on to after this. But what we will do right now is I prepared a little slideshow with some of the images that you've made over the course of your career in chronological order. Clearly, I don't cover every single work you've ever done because we'd be here forever.
Yeah, right.
And I figured we could talk about it and the creative process behind it and how you evolved as an artist during those times.
Sounds good.
Here we go. Okay. So, can you see my screen? It is.
Yes.
So it's a picture of you. This is what we used for the promotional headshot. I would like to focus on this very quickly. That looks like a very recent drawing on your drawing board right there of one Mr. Tom Sturridge from Netflix's
Right.
Sandman.
Right. Yeah. That was there's a magazine called Den of Geek. I don't know much about them, but they're relatively international, and they contacted me. Well, Neil contacted me first because he was suggesting me to them to do some sort of promotional piece to support the Sandman Netflix show. And so I came out. It was originally going to be a cover for the magazine for the San Diego Comic Convention special that they were going to make. But the idea I had wasn't necessarily going to work well as a front cover. And so they decided to use it as an exclusive image from me as the back cover. And it's sort of the piece itself kind of tells a little story about the, Sandman coming from comics and moving into film. And so part of that was being able to do a likeness of Tom Sturridge at the bottom of the piece, which was cool. So it's sort of like a screen coming out of the pages of a comic. It was fun. But
yeah,
so that's what that is.
I have seen that piece. And in that particular piece, you do start with comic book Sandman and you go into Netflix's Sandman. Do you think
Or at least
Neil Gaiman?
My take on the comic Sandman.
Well, there is a lot of versions of the comic Sandman.
That's true.
Do you think Neil Gaiman thought of you for that particular piece specifically because you were able to mix styles?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I know that, I mean, when you watch the show, there's bits and pieces where you can kind of see some inspiration from some of the things that Overture was, the feel of Overture in some places. So I don't know if it was like something that the Netflix people thought of the idea from Neil, from the production side of the show, of what might kind of make a cool fit for a promotional piece of art that wasn't the typical film-like poster type thing. So I really don't know the specifics behind why they came to me, other than, I heard directly from Neil, like saying, "Oh, it would be great to have you do it," so, which was very nice. You would think they would want to pick somebody from the origins of the Sandman comic to start off with, but I don't know. Maybe I was the first one that said yes. I don't know.
I feel like you're so closely tied to Sandman now after Overture, but we will get to that in a bit. Let's go first to 1997. So in 1997, DC Comics had what was called a fifth week event. That is, so for people who don't know, every comics come out every Wednesday. American comics come out every Wednesday. Well, I guess it's Tuesday now for DC Comics, but back then it was every Wednesday for DC Comics. So if there's 5 weeks, there's kind of a publishing gap in that month. So for one of those fifth week events, what DC did was it took a bunch of the old names, the old established names, such as Green Lantern, and decided if we're going to create something new around this name, we're going to, this is what it's going to be. That's why it's called Tangent. You did this with James Robinson, and you were inked by Mick Gray.
Yeah.
And can you talk about what Green Lantern, this particular iteration of Green Lantern, meant to you?
Well, when I first got, I had no idea what the premise was I knew what the Tangent universe thing was supposed to be, but I didn't know what Green Lantern itself was going to be until I got the script from James. And, they said, it was super fascinating because right at the beginning of the script, they set out to say, oh, this is going to be kind of more like an anthology comic where this Green Lantern character, acts as if she's the host to tell these stories, like a classic crypt keeper type of thing or whatever, but from a more of a supernatural superhero kind of, wasn't necessarily horror, let's put it that way. It was fascinating to me because I didn't realize when I said, yeah, I would do it, that it was going to be an anthology. And then when I saw that, I'm like, this is really interesting that they're asking me, one person, to do an anthology comic when that's usually not the case for an anthology comic. Usually an anthology comic is a different creative team for every story, where this one was going to be the same team for every story. But I thought I didn't want each of those stories to feel the same. What is so enjoyable about an anthology comic is those differences of story from the creative teams being different. And so I said to myself, I think I want to try to emulate that, make it feel like a traditional anthology comic where you'd have different effects going on with the art and different styles. And so that was pretty fascinating. That was my first kickoff with that, and trying to figure out what to do and how different can I make the styles, so much so where people had to double check the credits, And of course, James Robinson wrote fantastic stories, as he usually does, so it was a lot of fun to play with.
I want to point out, James Robinson might not be a name that a lot of people talk about today because he doesn't really do a lot of comics anymore. In the 90s, he was one of the most critically acclaimed writers in comics at the time. And that was very well deserved. So that also kicks off another trend in your work. So, but to your point, these 3 pages are from the same comic.
Yeah, exactly.
And none of them look anything alike.
No. And then even the introduction pages where Green Lantern herself is on the page, it was again a fourth style that was different than these two. So that was a super interesting challenge for me creatively to see, you know, how successful could we do that. And it turned out to be, it was rather effective, I felt, because it really enhanced the differences in how each story felt different from each other, to, you know, in the type of story James was telling. So I feel like it enhanced what he was trying to do.
So you're, you know, the way your career has evolved, it has basically gone into a thing where you do a mishmash of styles. Would you
Yeah.
say this was the trigger point?
No, actually, I would say, when was this published? I don't remember.
1997.
So before Promethea, actually. I think the trigger point actually goes, I guess maybe it was an impetus for me to try it, for sure. I dabbled a little bit here and there on things like in Chase, there's a few stylistic things I try, but they're not as overt as this. But one of the things I thought about, even before I became a professional comic artist, was seeing other artists that I admire be able to switch gears. And this particular little short comic here that James wrote kind of gave me the impetus to try something that I admire seeing from others. And a great example of this is Frank Miller. So when you examine Frank Miller's Daredevil to his Dark Knight to Ronin to Sin City, they are all drastically different from each other.
Yeah.
They might have similar pacing sensibilities that Miller might have, but the way he draws is so dramatically different in each one of those. And I was exposed to that, you know, from the outset, and it really intrigued me as an artist myself, as something that would be really fun to not be limited to one style. And Miller was a good example of that, of how it could be done successfully.
I want to dwell on that a little bit about Frank Miller, because, you know, as the more expressionistic Frank Miller got with his art, it seemed like the more he had room to be absurd in his writing.
Yeah.
So, you know how like Sin City is like, oh yeah, it's this big crime noir back alley thing. Oops, they're ninjas now. Right. And we just accept it.
Yeah.
Do you find that happens with you, like depending on the art style that you're using?
I think, yeah, I mean, in some ways that's probably true, because some of my decisions that I make when I'm toying around with styles is more based on my gut instincts, approaching it instinctually and drawing what I feel or what the story is telling me. You know, what I'm getting out of the story when I read that script. You know, certain images or art styles will come to mind when I read it. And that's how this was done with the Tangent book, was just sort of like finding something that felt right for what that story was, and I don't try to overanalyze it. So like when you were saying, like, you know, Miller all of a sudden throwing in ninjas in there, I have a feeling it's kind of an instinctual decision that he's making. It's not overly calculated. He's just doing, I could be wrong, I don't want to speak for him, but the feeling I get is that he's doing what feels right to him at the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Sin City has always felt like he's having a lot of fun, and yeah, he's not really thinking about it way too much.
Yeah,
which is cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
Let's move forward by a year. So this is from Chase, and I very specifically chose this from Chase so that all of you Batman fans are happy. Okay. From here we can see your design sense as well, right? So you have these circles on the corners of the page. This is a spread. This is in fact 2 pages, and you have the way it's framed is Batman's on top, and Chase and the others are on the lower right. But
Yeah.
because of the framing, they can both be facing the audience.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about Chase and what that meant to you in your evolution as an artist?
Well, I think what mattered to me most about Chase, how personal it got for me and Dan Johnson, my co-creator on that, really quickly. I mean, ultimately Chase came about, this is a little bit of a funny story, but initially Chase came about because I don't remember exactly how the conversation went, but the editor I was working with at DC was curious about us pitching for something. So I had done a thing called Hell's Abyss, or the Abyss Hell's Sentinel or whatever, which was like this, featured a different version or a changed version of Alan Scott, the original Green Lantern. And DC was interested in trying to do something with that version of Alan Scott. And so I said, hey, you know, would you be open to a pitch for that, right? As a series. And so Dan and I got our heads together and pitched a concept. And it ended up, the editor liked what we did, but they ended up going with a different direction and decided not to pursue Alan Scott as an ongoing thing in that way, at least in his own series. But they liked what we did enough that the editor was like, hey, why don't you pitch us something, you know, come up with something brand new and pitch us. And my conversation with them was, you know, like, oh, well, I mean, what are you interested in? What do you want to see? What would be interesting to you as an editor to see for a pitch? And he hilariously said, oh, chicks with capes. I love chicks with capes. And so Dan and I were like, okay. And but we went back and we're thinking about it, and we came back with this, here's this, you know, disheveled, cranky detective character that wears a trench coat. Trench coat's kind of like a cape, right? You know, but she's a detective and she's cranky and she has, you know, powers, but she's trying to suppress her powers, and she hates people who have superpowers because of this messed up relationship she had with her dad, and ends up becoming this agent for the government called the Department of Extranormal Operations. And it evolved into something kind of sophisticated really quickly. And so it ended up becoming quite personal work for Dan and I, even though it started off as just being something to trying to pitch a project to try to get work, you know. That I find pretty fascinating, how some of these things we can get really invested in quickly when they start off as something that might not have been as didn't have such a personal investment right away. You know, so Chase, for me, that's what I think about with Chase, is this character that Dan and I fell in love with really quickly, and allowed us to kind of try our hand at doing a comic that was sort of like, here's a comic of write a comic, create a comic. He and I create the stories of a comic that we would like to read. You know, like if someone else had done this idea, we'd totally buy into it. We'd love it, you know. So
yeah, unfortunately, Chase was one of those casualties of that 1998 DC expansion that didn't really, like, there were a lot of good titles at the time.
Great titles, and everything new that was launched that year just didn't make it through. They all got canceled. The weird thing with Chase, everyone at DC seemed to love what we were doing enough that to launch the series, they gave us a guest spot where Chase got to be introduced in Batman 550. So that was her first encounter with Batman, is in that. And that's the way we got to introduce the character before launching into her first issue, which was really great. And they even had us design like little file cards from the DEO, which was pretty cool. they did all this thing, all the things like that. But then, like, as far as company-wide advertising, there was none. It was in Scooby-Doo. We saw an ad in Scooby-Doo, and we're like, what?
Yes,
I
because
don't
the
know.
audience for Scooby-Doo will definitely.
I don't know. It's just so weird, how they would be robust on one hand and, say, oh, we're going to introduce the character in Batman as a kickoff. But then if no one was reading, if there's people that might like the series, but they're not reading Batman, they'd never know it existed, so you have to read Batman to know about the character existing. So it's pretty funny.
Was this your first writer credit?
Yeah.
What did that do for you, like, mentally?
Well, I mean, Dan and I, before I had a professional comics career, I always wanted to tell my own stories. I always had ideas, and Dan knew that. So I knew Dan from well before my comics career kicked off. We were friends and hung out all the time. And we have several ideas that just shoved in a drawer that we have never been able to do. So Chase was kind of my first professional avenue to kind of show that I'm not just someone interested in making pretty pictures. I want to tell stories that people can care about. And so that it meant a lot to me to be able to show that, especially so early in my career.
And speaking of writing, I couldn't pick just one image from Promethea, so we're going to go through a few.
Oh, that's okay.
This is one of the
I like that one.
spread out covers for one of the absolute editions of Promethea.
Yeah.
Promethea is a series that you did with Alan Moore. You were also inked by Mick Gray. Alan Moore has won more Eisners for best writer than anyone in existence.
Yeah.
I just going to put that out there for anyone who wants to know the credentials for this series. And so Promethea had, would you say this was the one that put you on the map?
Probably. I think some of the things I was doing before was getting attention, but this was the one where, because it was so such a particular singular collaborative thing between Alan and I and the rest of the ABC team, that it ended up having such a unique voice to it that people couldn't help but recognize it. It was because you're not, the other things I had done before were cool, but most of what I'd done before was dabbling with other people's characters in one way or another, right? Where this was something where Alan and I got to kind of make this thing from the ground up, and our hearts and souls were in it, and I think people could recognize that.
Yeah. There's a point in it where you and Alan make a cameo and you're shaking each other's hand at the train station.
Yeah.
And it's basically been said that as much as he was the writer on it, it also became intensely personal for you.
Yes. Yeah. That was a fun scene to draw, because I think Alan wrote that into the script that we should do that. I think there's even in that same, not that same scene, but there's a panel near there where Rick Veitch is in it. Because he wanted to be, I think he told Alan that I want a cameo in Promethea, and so he got a little cameo shot in there. But that was, Alan and I hadn't actually met face to face at that point yet, and so it was kind of cool getting to meet in our imaginations inside the immateria. Well, not the immateria, but a different plane of existence.
Yeah.
So in some ways, it was like perfectly appropriate that we shook hands in our art before we actually ever met face to face.
There is a clear evolution of your art from the beginning of Promethea to the end of Promethea. Did you feel that happening as it was going?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I try to do with every project is, to try to improve along the way, or try different things along the way. And Promethea was sort of like fertile ground for allowing that evolution to speed up, I guess you could say, because the way the tales were constructed and the ideas behind the themes behind a lot of what we were doing was about imagination and kind of like being willing to try things. And as soon as I was able to do that, it allowed me to progress in ways that I think, like, if I had just stayed on a regular superhero title, nothing against superheroes, but if I had just stayed on a regular superhero title, those evolutions might not have been as quickly forthcoming. And Promethea was sort of designed to see where we could go. And that certainly is what I needed. I needed to be able to do that.
Look at this design sense, though. Look at how it's both symmetrical, and you're showing both versions of Promethea. So, spoiler for anyone who hasn't read it, at some point she changes her costume. And then the symbolism and all of the stars and the caduceus and the colors that you use on either side. That's a lot of thought that goes into this.
Yeah, it was one of the tougher designs that I came up with, because there was a lot of information to try to convey in there without it feeling, I mean, it's busy, but without it being too busy. And I wanted each section to sort of represent what issues are in this volume. And so I came up with these little design pieces to kind of represent that. But I didn't want them butted up against each other. I wanted something that was like flashy and bright, almost like a flag,
Yeah.
And so those stylized rays of light coming from the two versions of Promethea, acting as these graphic, like almost like a flag mentality to it, dramatic. I felt like was the cool thing to do to break up those images, forcing it into poster art design, I guess you could say. And then I personally like the postures between the two different Prometheas, how one is quieting down and another one is awakening, which I thought was kind of fun. And then my other favorite part is what I decided to do to number it. So each volume has a 1 or a 2 or a 3, but using a hand to do it, So I thought that was fun.
But what is the significance of the weeping gorilla? No.
I don't know. It's this weird thing that Alan came up with. I don't know what prompted it, other than maybe it was he liked cheeky cartoons.
I love
Alan
that gorilla,
has a great
though.
sense of humor. I mean, amazing sense of humor. I think it gave him the opportunity to, like, I don't know, he just wanted, it was sort of like, at least within Promethea, I don't know about some of the other ABC books, but it's just one more layer of this is a thing in this world, this cartoon character, and it's super popular, and I think he thought I think he probably enjoyed the irony that the humor was all based on sadness or existential crisis.
For anyone who has never read the series, I am about to blow your mind with, I think, the next 2 slides. 3. The next 3 slides. This is insane. So this is the two of the Prometheas walking across a Mobius strip. And in this particular Mobius strip, this means that they're walking down this way and over, and then now they're walking under it, and then it just keeps on going round and round.
Yeah.
What madness leads people to do such a thing?
I don't know why Alan thought of it. I'm not sure what he was trying to say by including it, other than that the idea that the journey they are on can feel endless, you know, symbolically, like this big quest can feel so big that will we ever see the end of it kind of notion. It does speak to that, especially when, you know, we have the night and day backgrounds going on. And the script for it, the script was the most difficult thing. I think it was something like, I want to say 4 or 5 pages long, one paragraph, single spaced, describing this whole Mobius strip. And it was so daunting to read that I had to kind of put it down. But then he also, I can't remember where the idea of breaking it into panels came from. If that was something I did or that was something he wanted, so he could control where the characters were placed. It probably was something he wanted, but it was so daunting of a script to read that I had to put it down. And me and my wife said, in order to figure out how to make it function, we created our own Mobius strip with a piece of ribbon. And then how that worked, I said, okay, I'm going to draw that. And then when Alan first saw the page, he was super fascinated, because I remember talking to him about it. He's like, this is super interesting, because I wrote a functioning Mobius strip and you drew a functioning Mobius strip, but they're not the same Mobius strip.
They twist in a different place.
I guess, I don't know, but he thought that was pretty fascinating. And I explained to him how I had to do it, because it was just like really hard to follow.
This is interesting, because I would have thought that the gutter idea would have come from you, like if I had to guess, because I feel like in a writer's mind, a letterer could probably control the flow of where the reader's going to go. But
yeah,
I think the gutters are essential here.
Yeah, I can't really remember the specifics of that. Yeah, it's been so long.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I'm going to go into another one that I think would blow people's minds. So there's this. So as you can see, everyone, Promethea is up here on top. There's a tarot card here, and then there's an anagram of Promethea using Scrabble tiles, or what looks like Scrabble tiles down here. And then there's another storyline. It's a joke being told by Aleister Crowley down here at the bottom. This is a loop going across all 22 pages of Promethea number 12. All of this is one connected image.
Yeah.
And once again, I ask, what sort of madness would possess a man to do such a thing?
Yeah, I don't know. I think Alan, of course, it's obvious when you look at his entire body of work up until the point of Promethea, he's always interested in trying to get something new out of what the work is, right? Trying to find new way to craft a tale, or to see what the form can do. There's little things that he would toy with. And I think when he and I got paired up, somehow along the way in the conversation early on, as I was starting to turn in pages for the beginning of the series, he saw that some of the things I was trying to do and toying with myself, that it sort of opened up a door to where he's like, we both sort of kind of like, there is nothing we won't try. Let's try anything. And that maybe inspired him to write something like this, to see what we could do, to toy with the whole idea of what to expect from a comic. And that whole issue, when it was originally proposed, actually was meant to be not stapled, but folded like an accordion. But or a double-sided accordion, it'd have to be probably. But for whatever reason, DC does, I don't know, maybe it was too expensive for them to figure that out, to print something that long, or what, just logistically, they said they couldn't do it. It was a budgetary issue. But Alan, when he wrote it to be this continuous strip, regardless of that. And I felt like we should do the same anyway. And but the fun part is, after the fact, is people, when they quickly realized what we were doing there, that they made mobiles out of it, where they would get more than one issue and they could tape the two ends together. So it was like this continuous loop. Probably the most fascinating thing to me, though, is we had decided to do it this way. But then as Alan was writing it, all of the ABC stuff, when he was writing it, quickly devolved into not getting full scripts. So you would get scene by scene. And by this point in Promethea, even though it's only issue 12, we're deep into that mode. But knowing that this was going to be a long
continuous
tapestry type of image, I would still only get pieces of the script. So like, here's the first 5 pages, here's the next, like you'd only write enough to keep me busy for the next week or so. And, so there's I would get to the end of a scene, or knowing I'm about to get to the end of the scene, and I called them up. I'm like, hey, I'm trying to figure out what to do with the design here. What's on the next page? And that I don't have yet. And he's like, honestly, Jim, I don't know, because I haven't written it yet, was the answer. And so I had to figure out, with working with his methodology, how to make it feel like it was still connecting. So whatever I did, even though I didn't know what was going to be on the next page, had to somehow feel like it lined up as I went along.
I heard from Jeremy Cox, your colorist on this series, that you did not draw this on one long board. It's still...
No, but I did tape them together as I went, just temporarily. So I would take whatever I did on the page before, and I would tape it and work out what I'm going to do to match it up, and then set the other one away.
Oh, so like you never did tape the whole 22 pages together?
No.
Okay.
That would be really difficult.
Because then he said he colored it digitally as one image, and I'm like, so
yes.
Jeremy Cox is the first person to see it as one long image.
Him and Jose Villarrubia. Villarrubia did all the
Crowley stuff.
Yeah, painting over my scratchy. I used a kind of a scratchy, Sienkiewicz, Michael Zulli kind of thing going on with some of that stuff, and basically told him to just use that as an under construction, and not be afraid to colorize the ink line, so it'd have a different feel from the rest of the colors. How the two of them blended what they were doing, him and Jeremy Cox, I'm not sure how that working process worked for them. And then on top of it, because Todd was doing lettering by hand through, I think, all of Promethea, but on this he had to do something different, to where I don't know if the lettering for... Yeah, I'm very curious if the lettering for the two caduceuses, the two snakeheads, that might actually still be on the board. But then when Jeremy colored it, needed to figure out how to make it seem transparent. And we went with a transparency idea because we felt the pages were going to be really packed to begin with, and felt like doing a transparency thing kind of loosens up the page a lot.
Is this series the last time you were inked by Mick Gray?
Yes.
Okay.
And
So
there was parts towards the end of the series where I was inking some things on my own, just uncredited in places, mainly because I needed to try to see what I could do. Like I was practicing, like there were certain things I wanted to try that I didn't feel like trying to pencil it.
Yeah.
And things like that. As a matter of fact, I think these tarot cards, I did the inking on the tarot cards.
So speaking of the end, so mindful of the time, I'm not going to spend too much time on the next one, but I just want to blow other people's minds as well. I think you know what's coming. So this is one of the first pages. Actually, this is the first page of the last issue of Promethea. This is 16 pages of the last issue of Promethea on the right.
Yeah.
This one on the left is that one.
Yes.
And so let's so you want to say a quick word about number 32?
Number 32 was another wild, crazy idea Alan had to make a comic. It's funny that he wanted to try to do this, considering that we were told no for the mobile issue. So on this one, he wanted to do a comic that unfolded to make a double-sided poster. So 16 images on one side, 16 images on another one. But if you were to read the comic, that there would still be individual pages. So different sections of the poster would make up each of the individual pages. And he figured out, he had dummy copies made where he folded up pieces of paper and all this stuff to figure out how it would work. And what it meant, like if it was going to be folded, delivered to the comic book stores folded, that would mean some of the images would be upside down. And so, but then of course, DC was like, we can't do that, it's crazy. That's gonna be really difficult to do. So the idea became, well, we'll just do the stable comic, but still have some of those pages printed upside down.
I really wish I bought two versions of that comic.
What's that?
I really wish I'd bought 4 issues of that comic.
And then, so basically it became this thing where people had to take it apart and tape together to make their own posters. Eventually, we decided one of the concessions that DC offered was to make the posters a separate item, like a limited number of them, a separate item that would come with a little collection of some of the Promethea covers, little booklet that would be signed by Alan and myself. And so we did that. That was one of the examples where I decided to ink myself, was on the cover of that one. That whole comic strip that serves as the color, as the cover for that, I inked myself. But, and all of Promethea 32 is me. There's no one else involved other than Todd Klein. Because there was no other way to do it. There was just, it'd be impossible to do what Alan was asking with with a whole bunch of other people in the pot. It just wouldn't work. But so the original comic was printed with some pages upside down, but then when they did the collection, I think they're all right set up. I can't remember, possibly. And the other funny thing about it is, it was the fastest issue of Promethea I drew.
That's insane.
And another weird production thing is, even though all the images are together on the poster, and you can see how they all connect by those trails that are there, leading you from the images into the text bits and all that kind of stuff. I've got a couple interesting things to think about with this, but all the original drawings are done at original comic book page size, like original art size.
Mm-hmm.
But then the paintings themselves were also done at the same size. And then we blew up the paintings, increased their size to place the art onto them.
Did the painting come before the drawings or the other way around?
I think other way around.
Okay.
I think I did the paintings last. And
That makes
I
sense.
wanted them to be, like this weird combination of pop art mixed with impressionism, mixed with modern art type ideas, or experimental stuff. And the result is when you see the images in the comic, just without the painting being so obvious. That was one of the funny things. Alan wanted the painting to be done in stipple, like a classical stipple effect, and I was like, that would take me a year. So I came up with this idea of like mashing together experimental art with pop art, and the end result is really cool, because when you see the individual page, you have no idea, based on those paint brush strokes, that it makes something. And I thought that was really appealing.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Yeah, and then by also using something so vivid and crazy and busy with the paint, when you look at it, even though the colors are really I don't know, there's like this, they're bizarre colors. It feels cosmic in a way, which I felt was super appropriate. But one of the most fascinating things, this has nothing to do with anything I did, but Alan, when he wrote this thing, I don't know how he did it, but if you're ever able to read the full poster, all the little trails, somehow it's like the way the human brain works. So you might read something up here and you follow the little trail, and it takes you to another idea, and it takes you to another idea. And then somewhere at the bottom, you go, oh, this relates to the very top, right? But it's almost like the human brain, the way, you could be in a conversation with somebody and they'll say one thing, and all of a sudden you get a different thought in your head that's in response to what they're saying, that might call back to something else, right?
Yeah.
And so the whole thing functions like that. I don't know how he did that, or if it was just, the magic of his process and letting things sort of happen organically.
We have this, and we also have so this one is When America's Best. So this is all of the superheroes or the characters from America's Best comics, which Alan Moore wrote all of them. We'll notice here that you drew all of them in different styles. You are emulating the styles of the people who are actually working on the strip. But this is from Seven Soldiers,
Right.
which is you with Grant Morrison. And again, these all look different. There's 3 different styles here. So both of these,
even 4 actually.
There are 4. Okay, yes, there are 4. Yeah, Bulleteer is right here too.
Yeah.
I missed that. So there's 4 different styles here, and there's 4 different styles here. So at this point, it looks like you are getting really used to putting together a multitude of styles.
Yeah. One of the things that was interesting to me about working on the last story in Promethea, basically the apocalypse is happening. And when Alan, for those who are not familiar, Promethea was part of a whole line of comics called the America's Best Comics, and there was a whole line of comics. But when Alan decided to shut the whole thing down and wanted to quit, he decided to make Promethea the engine of why that is happening. Therefore, he told me ahead of time that he was going to have many of the other characters from America's Best Comics from the entire line show up in Promethea. But each one of those comics was so distinct and so particular that I didn't think it would have been smart on my part to just draw them however the heck I wanted to, and have people who read those books be able to go, oh, this is the apocalypse involving the entire universe of these characters, and have them be satisfied with that. So I'm like, no, I got to try and make these characters look like people recognize them who were fans of, say, Tom Strong or Johnny Future or whatever, that they can recognize those characters based on style, and that they feel like, oh no, they really did step out of their own comics and are now interacting with what Promethea is doing, and have that feel natural enough. Granted, there's certain things I do that those other artists don't do. So it's sort of like me kind of like, well, it has a lot of my construction underneath, you know what I mean? On the way a scene might be constructed, was still going on. So it was more about trying to capture the spirit and essence of what those other books were doing. And then that translated into further thought as I went along with other things. And Grant certainly picked up on that. So when he wrote Seven Soldiers of Victory and wanted me to do the bookends for that, he was very much like, hey, what can we do to capture this the sense of these different diverse characters' realities, their experiences. And so I took it even further with Seven Soldiers of Victory. And that got tricky too. So like in the first volume of Seven Soldiers of Victory, I got to do whatever I wanted, excluding the Kirby thing. The Kirby hat was very intentional. Grant wanted this Kirby aspect to it. And so I tried to figure out, how can I present Kirby, but in a way that maybe Kirby might not have done. And that's where you get like this weird mix of pop art colors going on, the way the colors are handled. But it still feels like Kirby when you read it. But then the rest of the characters in there, I was able to kind of like just do what I wanted to do and see what would happen.
Yeah.
But when it came time to do the last chapter, the final bookend, where I was coming back, now all the story was dealing with the characters that other artists got to play with that were in between those two bookends.
Specifically seven titles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when I found out that the last bookend was going to be dealing with those characters, not what I did in the first chapter, then it came back to the same thinking. How do I do this in a way for people who've read the entire saga, for them to go, oh yeah, okay, yeah, this is the character. The Shining Knight character looks like the Shining Knight character that was in the Shining Knight miniseries. It all lines up. Otherwise it would have been such a huge disservice, and probably been, I don't know, I kind of feel like it's more and it's not about trying to mimic those people who did that work. It was more kind of like an acknowledgement of what they did and holding true to what they brought to the table. And I felt like, again, the last chapter, if I had handled all these characters in a way that was just disregarding what they had done, the whole thing would have fell flat. It just would have completely collapsed on itself, and not been nearly as satisfying. So it's the same mentality.
I mean, yes, but that doesn't apply to this. So in this one, this is
a little bit.
No, but I mean, these don't actually exist though. So
Correct.
So this is the Club of Heroes from Batman, also written by Grant Morrison. And what you did, so all of these are older characters from the 50s and 60s, where they were the quote unquote Batmen of their nations. And when you reconvene them, these guys have not been seen for decades. When you reconvene them, you drew them all in a different style, as if they all stepped out of a comic book.
Correct.
But of course they did not. You did that on your own.
Correct. Because, and I felt like what it would do is ground these characters. We have very little time to get to know who these characters were in the story. It's only a three issue storyline that Grant wrote in the middle of this other big epic thing he was doing. And I felt like we had very little time to get to understand who these characters were. So I thought about, what could I do stylistically that as soon as you look at them, without them saying a word, the reader should get some sort of sense of who they are. Something about them stands out to, would stand out and make them think about, oh, maybe this person kind of is like this, just by the way they were drawn. But then I wanted to extrapolate it further, because some of these characters, like you were saying, were introduced way back in Batman DC history. And the way Grant wrote this story is not these guys coming out of retirement after all this time. They've all been running around doing their own thing ever since those original tales were told. We just had never been privy to them. And that gave me the notion of like, okay, what do their comic books look like that we have never seen? And that's what led me further into the idea of stylizing each one of them so distinctly different from each other. And then some of them I was even like, oh, well, what did their comic look like? Maybe this artist was the artist on that comic. We just never saw it, that kind of came to my mind too. So that was super fun to explore.
That's a fun game for you guys out there to play. Try to figure out which artist you're emulating here.
And
I know
of them
the
are so
answers,
obvious. Some of
so
them are a mashup too. Some of them are a mashup of artists.
I know
So-
most of the answers, so I'm not gonna let you guys know. So, although I will say that this guy is
Uh-huh.
another guest that PICOF has later this weekend. Okay. Okay, so the next 3 slides are, so this is how you drew Batwoman in action, which is
Mhm.
fascinating because this is simultaneously 1 panel and 7 panels in one,
Yeah.
in one spread. This is how you drew her civilian identity, Kate Kane. I can feel more of a David Mazzucchelli type vibe going on, more down to earth.
Before she, this is how I handled those scenes before she becomes Batwoman. Yeah.
And this is how you handle her before she becomes Batwoman, meeting
Yeah.
Batman. There's
Yeah.
literally 2 different styles here interacting.
Yes. That's the key to all of this. Yeah. Is that interacting. That's one of the things that Grant was asking me. He interviewed me for Comic-Con one year. And it was around the time we were working on the Batman story that we just talked about a couple minutes ago. And he was very curious. He's like, how are you doing that? And I really didn't have an answer for him, which frustrated him because I'm like, I don't know. He's like, oh, come on. How do you not know? But I think that over years I've thought about it. And I think the trick is because they're all grounded they are all walking around in the same environment. So that helps you ground what's happening. All the way I handle the environments is sort of in a more realistic way. So whenever I do something that's a little strange, but the backgrounds remain realistic or have a certain attitude towards them, no matter what the other character style is, you can't help but believe that they both exist in the same scene, if that makes sense.
I feel like that's a tightrope to be walking on, because I buy it with your work, but with, like, let's say, what's to stop it from veering a little too far into that and becoming something that looks like Roger Rabbit? You know what I mean?
Right.
But with your work, I can see it. Do you know that I looked up the last time somebody tried to do mashup styles in one book, and the most recent time before you that I saw, where it's not a plot point, right? Where it's not a plot point that they look different, is you'd have to go back to the Golden Age Marvel family, where they draw Captain Marvel the way CC Beck draws Captain Marvel Jr. the way Mac Rayboy draws Captain Marvel Jr.
Oh, that's interesting.
And
love
Mary
to see
Marvel
that.
the way Mark Swayze draws Mary Marvel.
Oh, I'd love to see that.
So it's not a thing that a lot of people do, unless it's a plot point again.
Right.
So
Well, and then
yeah,
that's the other thing, like dabbling with styles. All the things that we've been pointing out are very plot point or meta commentary oriented. But there are times where I decide to to fuss with style, some of the stuff I did in Desolation Jones is a great example of this, where it's all about the feeling that style invokes, or to gain a certain type of effect that has nothing to do with plot. So like in Jones, I would switch up styles sometimes on the same page to garner a different emotional response from the reader, just to try to pull something else out of the reader that they didn't expect to have when they're taking in the story. Or to do things like in Jones, I would occasionally do something like, there's all this action happening, it's all done relatively standard, but then all of a sudden this one moment would go all black and white, no backgrounds, or minimal backgrounds, but then the character might, instead of having hard shadows and be drawn the way I drew them before, I'm using this tight cross-hatching style. And that was my trying to see if there was a way. How do you make a comic feel like it's going in slow motion like you do in an action film scene when you want to emphasize something dramatic? How do you do that in a comic? And that was sort of like, well, maybe a style could do that, where, you know, by making the character have all this cross-hatching detail, it subconsciously forces the reader's eye. They have to stop and slow down to take in that figure. And then all of a sudden it picks back up when it jumps back into color in the next panel. You know what I mean? So sometimes the style choices are more about what I can kind of get out of the pacing or the emotional aspect I'm trying to pull out of the reader, and not be about plot.
Next one, let's talk about something trending. We have the Sandman. Did you like the show?
Oh yeah, very much actually.
How'd you feel very early on in episode 1 when it was clearly taking some cues from Sandman Overture, which is, for those who don't know, Sandman ran from 1988 to 1994, and then in 2015, Neil Gaiman did a prequel sequel called Sandman Overture. Yeah, how did that feel, seeing that on the screen?
Yeah, it was pretty wild. You know, there were certain things I didn't know that they were going to do, because I, you know, like everyone else, I didn't get to see it ahead of time. So seeing some of the stuff for the first time, like, you know, when you see one of the scenes that takes place right after this in kind of has a version of it in the show. And it was so cool seeing a version of Morpheus that looked a lot like some of the illustrations that I had done in Overture, with some of the smoky, wispy effects and stuff going on. I didn't know that they were going to do that. I remember, it's been quite a while now, but I remember Neil asking me to get a good high-res version of one of the illustrations I had done for the Absolute edition of Overture, one of the covers. And he said he wanted it, the producers of the show wanted it, and knew they could get it more quickly from me than trying to go through DC stuff, you know. And so I sent it over to him, and he said, oh, it's going to be for some sort of animated thing. And I thought, oh, they're just going to use it in some sort of promo thing to, you know, here's the you know, an image from the famous comic that, and now we're making the show. So I thought it was going to be something like that. But I think they wanted to see the wispiness with the helmet on, really, in order to try and capture that for that scene in the show. I mean, that's the only thing I can ascertain. And then there was bits where on the gates to the Dreaming are they're literally taken right out of Overture. I mean, there's panels on the gates that are basically 3D carved versions of the exact panels.
Yeah,
at least to me, that's what it looks like to me. On the front gates, I couldn't tell what's on the back inside of the gate, but there's more stuff on the inside of the gate, but I couldn't make out what it was, if that's some stuff from other Sandman collaborators or not. But when seeing that was just so cool, a lot of fun. Oh, and we get to see for half a second we get to see the ship, the sailing ship, in that ends up being an important piece in Overture. And that was shown randomly at the beginning, in the first episode of the series of the Netflix show. I didn't expect that either. That was pretty cool.
The ship is not one of my slides, just because I couldn't find one that wouldn't spoil it for anyone who hasn't read it.
Right.
It's so weird talking about Sandman now, because it's like I want to talk about the comic, but I can't talk about the comic if people are only watching the show, because now I have all of these spoilers.
Right, and it makes me wonder. Hopefully, this isn't spoilery. Yeah, it's really not spoilery, because they'll see it in the show. If they've watched the show, this is something they might not have noticed. But it's fascinating to me. I don't know how many people who have watched the show. I haven't been able to talk to a lot of people. The scene that we were talking about, where it's clearly the Overture Sandman confronting the Corinthian in the show. There's that bit when he's confronting him, but then he's disappearing. He's being called away, right? Disappearing. We don't know what's going on. In the comic version, that scene takes place in a different location, but he's called away, but then comes back to try to finish the conversation, and then is gone again in the comic, and not beyond his control. But in the show, what's fascinating is because they have that scene, and then the next time we see Morpheus and he's being captured by the villains in the TV show, the clothes don't match. So is anybody going to pick up on that? You know what I mean? What happened there?
Something happened in between. Ooh.
Yeah. Which is what Overture is.
Does Neil Gaiman tell you to make the panels the Corinthians' eye teeth, or is that something you do yourself?
That's me. Yeah.
If this had been Alan Moore, would he have told you? Would it have come from him?
It depends. If he had the idea, he would put that in the script. There was different things. There were some occasions here and there in Overture scripts where Neil had an idea, but not necessarily a layout idea, more about, what if this thing here is like this? And then I would figure out how to make it do what I do with the layouts. So the process on working on Overture is interesting. So I don't work with thumbnails or do preliminary sketches or pencils or anything like that. I just go straight to design.
I'm going to point out to everyone watching right now that you just said you don't do thumbnails.
Well, correct. Yes. Yeah. And so
we've spoken about that before, but yes, everyone, he doesn't do thumbnails.
So what happens is when I read a script, even if it's my own script, I'll have ideas will come to my mind about how to approach the scene visually from a layout or a style or whatever. And I will just try to do that on the board at the time. And I don't do the thumbnails. This is a bit of a tangent from where I was going, but I don't do the thumbnails because the way my brain works, I feel too attached to what the thumbnail is doing.
Yeah.
But when I go to the final, I would struggle sometimes if the final isn't matching or going the way the thumbnail did, and I would fight with it. I would be sitting there fighting it. Why isn't it? It's working the way it does on this little crappy sketch. It's not the same size and all that stuff. So I got rid of doing thumbnails. That way it allowed me to, like, whatever idea I have for the layout lives up here. And then when I go to do the final drawing, if it isn't working and the drawing's now telling me to do something else, I feel like I have the ability to just listen to what it's telling me it has to be, rather than this other thing. But in terms of the scripts with Overture versus layout ideas, one of the things I would get the scripts from Neil, And since I don't do thumbnails, and that was something that I think Neil wasn't used to, or Shelley Bond was used to, but I didn't really, I couldn't change my methods. It's like, this is the way I do it. I even got to a point where I told him I need to see the whole script from the beginning to end so I can make decisions how the end's going to relate to the beginning of a chapter. So what I would get the script from Neil, I would read it, and then as I read it, I would let ideas come to my head, and then I would reconfigure the script, putting in things like the number of speech balloons that are on a page, the number of captions that are on a page, and I would number all those things so I could see them clearly when I'm figuring out my layout. And in that process, I would type in new paragraphs in a different color, like red or blue or something, saying, here's my idea for this page, how this page would work. And then I would send that back to them. And that's how that was how they could see my thought processes ahead of time without doing thumbnails.
I'm going to skip this next one. I just wanted to point it out to everyone because it looks really pretty.
I like that one a lot.
It's great. Yeah, but I'm gonna go right to here because this is all the different versions of Dream. So something that our Netflix viewers also are able to see is that depending on who you are, you view the endless in a different way. And
Yeah.
therefore, if you're a different race, a different culture, in these cases, aliens and apparently cats, the Dream Lord Morpheus will look different. So once again, here you go, mashing up different styles.
Yeah.
And is this Mobius
one,
the living vampire?
Kinda, could be. That
Okay.
was I thought of the character being sort of a vampire-like inspiration, but more like an old 70s fantasy version or whatever, something weird. Some of the characters on here Neil had thought of, and some of them I thought of. So like he knew he wanted like a Kirby influenced Morpheus. I guess this vampire looking guy is a little bit on that too. But so is the feet of this stone guy.
Yeah.
You guys probably can't see that I'm pointing at it, but but there was room in there. And of course the giant cat, so the other fun thing about the process of Sandman Overture is before he wrote any scripts, he asked me for a list of things I would love to draw. And I gave him this long list of things, just random things that came to my head. Some of them were specific, some of them were just like really loose ideas. And he somehow managed to work every single one of them into the 6 issues in some way as we went along. So that's why towards the end of the story, when we see, or in the middle of the story, when we see Morpheus on this alien world and it's like a Western town, that's because I wanted to draw a Western, that kind of stuff, or insects, or or cats. And when I said I love cats, he came up with this idea to do this thing with this giant cat, stuff like that. But there's all kinds of influences on this page, different styles I'm dabbling with here.
This is 4 pages too, so this is bigger than your regular 2-page spread. But is there anything you don't like to draw? Not a single
one of them is the same style. That was key.
Is there anything you don't like to draw?
Cityscapes are really hard. I'm not a big fan of them. I feel like I don't do them as well as I would like. I think I could do them as well as I like, but it would take me 3 times as long as some of these other artists that can do great cityscapes. Another
like Gene Ha.
Yeah. I also feel like I'm not the best at crowd scenes either, or team books. So ironically, the fact that Echolands is a multicast series is
I was gonna say, well, that's a good segue to my next slide. So
okay.
Your current book, Echolands, the volume 1 is currently out. Oops, my background is killing that. So volume 1 is currently out. So this is a world in which every land is influenced by a different genre of fiction. How can you say you're not good at group shots? Look at that.
I've honestly, I feel like I really struggle with them. And I don't feel like I'm as deft with it as some other people who, I feel like my crowds don't necessarily always feel as natural as I would want them to be. Where there's some other people that are just really, really great at it. Jeff Darrow does an amazing crowd, right? So
yeah, the guy who draws Where's Waldo.
Yeah.
But so Echolands, look at that. There's each character here is drawn in a different style. I guess two of them are drawn in the same style, but so you're drawing off of different influences. So for everybody who comes to my channel, we do go over each issue of Echolands each time it comes out. So this is the cover of the first hardcover that is out. This is Romulus fighting the villain. So as you can see here, it's drawn in a very specific style, very Kirby-ish style, very Jack Kirby-ish style. I think what people will see here is the back of this is Romulus's glove. It's a close-up of Romulus's glove, because this particular issue is you continue the fight in the background. But I will point out that this is from the same comic where there is a painted rocket ship. So talk to us a little bit about Echolands.
Well, Echolands, one of the things, Haden and I wanted to tell an adventure tale that on the surface will seem simplistic, as all, grand adventure tales tend to be. But as we go along, as the story unfolds, it will slowly become more complex, which I find really cool and gratifying, because the main character, Hope, which is the character in the center of this image here, was a character I had thought of as a kid, and therefore I had a lot of kid-like notions about what her story would be. And so the fact that we're now getting to tell her story and do it in a modern comic, now that I'm, a much older individual, that thematically, the fact that the story will transition from something simplistic adventure, almost naive in a way, into something more sophisticated, and by the end have something to say and for people to think about, is pretty cool. So in essence, the work now is an echo of what I was thinking of as a child. So there's all kinds of things like the term Echolands, the idea of an echo, everything about this echoes something. It will remind people of certain things. And if it doesn't, you will still, at the very least, get the idea that this character is way different than this other character because he's from somewhere else, at the very minimum. And so
you can see it here in this particular page, like everyone's drawn in a different style.
Yeah, exactly. And we wanted to do something, we wanted to create a world where I could dabble as much as I wanted to visually. But at the end of it, when we finally have told our tale and we learn about what the Echolands really are, all these different styles will have a reason that they exist. But a lot of it is, the original impetus was, that's a cool idea, but the original impetus was, being able to be open creatively to do things, just toy around with different things and have fun, and ultimately have it be a fun comic to dive into, not just for, the creative side, but for hopefully the reader side.
Echolands has been out for, it's been over a year. How's the reception been for
it? The people who've read it seem to like it. I don't know how robust its shelf life is, or what the ultimate sales are going to be, but it seems like people like it. And and honestly, pretty much everything I've worked on has always been like a slow burn. You know, ironically, like, you know, when we were talking about Sandman Overture, how it was amazing to me that while it was coming out, how many people still didn't know it existed. And DC had been, and DC had been advertising it for a year. And we were hearing from people that, like, I had no idea that this thing was, you know, in existence. So, yeah, everything I've worked on has kind of had a slow burn, but in some ways that might be good, because hopefully what that means that, you know, with something like Echolands, it'll be like many of my other projects where they'll have longevity, rather than a quick flash and then it's over, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, I think also maybe with Sandman, it's because probably maybe the people saying that were people who had stopped reading comics, but
Yeah.
would have come back for Sandman if they had known. But since they weren't
Yeah.
tuned into the comic book scene, they didn't know.
Yeah, that's very, very much possible. And then as far as, you know, the other thing with Echolands, I have to, you know, have to be okay with whatever the response is in terms of how broad the audience it's reaching, because this is going to be a long-term project. It's a big project. It's going to be one of the longest things I've done in my career, outside of Promethea, probably. And so it's a long road, you know.
Promethea is the longest with 32 issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so with Echolands, it's going to be a long road, which might be fine, you know. Then that might be great that it's a slow burn, because might just enhance the whole notion of it having a longevity, which is ultimately what every, you know, creator wants. They want their stuff to continue to have life after they're done with it, right? So
yeah, absolutely. And it would make a great series, it would make a great movie, it would make a great video game.
Yeah, I hope so. That'd be cool.
I feel like people making toys out of it would have a difficult time, because they'd have to come up with all sorts of different molds.
Yeah, but it would be so cool, right?
But it would be really cool.
It would also make a great tabletop role-playing game.
Yes. So Echolands Volume 1 is out right now, everyone. And if you can see, so anybody watching this, so you've got, oh, look, all I'm going to say to there's a mecha here, okay? Go get it. And clearly an infusion of different styles, which leads me to my first viewer question. So this is from Cam. A lot of beginner artists are focused on developing their own unique, consistent art style. And yet your talk showcased such a large variety, even blending multiple styles in one comic. What sort of advice do you have for these types of artists? Do you need to sacrifice consistency for variety?
Yeah, that's really tough. I mean, I understand that that emotional drive to have your own unique style. I had that same thing before I became a professional comic artist, when I was just drawing, where I was like wanting to be find something that was my voice. But then at the same time, I couldn't help but be attracted to things like what we're talking about with Frank Miller, and seeing how, well, that's one person, and look at all these different things they can do. Why am I limiting myself? And then as I got further into my comics career, I kind of had an epiphany. By exploring different styles and trying different things, or trying to get a different kind of effect, it takes some research to do that sometimes. And you start going back into comics history and seeing what came before you. And it sounds weird to say, but I kind of came to the conclusion that nothing I do hasn't been done before. I'm not trying to say this as a discouragement to artists. I think this is something that they could actually emotionally become a stronger artist because of this, is to understand that before you, there was all kinds of other artists doing things that you might be thinking of now, but you didn't expect to see that in something old. And so it's kind of humbling in a way, to where you come out of it, we're like, okay, nothing I come up with is 100% original. It's all been done before. So something, everything is derivative of something else, and that's not bad. All it means is that there's a wide swath of creativity in the world, and you might as well plummet and take from it, learn from it. And that kind of freed me up to go, oh, there's no reason I can't try whatever I want to try. If I'm interested in a certain type of effect because of this style in this comic, like an old Mobius comic, and I'm enamored with it, I want to try, how can I create the feeling that gave me into something else? There's no reason not to. And just embrace that diversity and let yourself be free about it. And this sounds a little strange, and I hope people don't take it the wrong way, but you have to take your ego out, and just be open creatively to try whatever, and understand that there's all kinds of things out there that are very similar to something you thought of, and it might have been done 50 years ago. It's very, very possible, almost guaranteed, because everything is so derivative. Art has existed for eons now, and so I think the best solution is to find ways to learn from what you're exposed to, and how do you reflect what you've learned. And the reason why I find that humbling is because it means anything I come up with today, it's more about what do I learn from that. So if I'm dabbling with a certain style or whatever, it's always a learning experience, and every learning experience means you get to grow, and your toolbox gets bigger, and that's super fun. And sometimes you end up settling into certain grooves too, like where as I go along, there's certain styles where I'm like, oh, I just have so much fun with this style. I want to do more with that style, and you start to focus in on certain things more than that as you go along too, because you connect with it.
Hence Echolands number 7.
Exactly.
How is that going?
It's done. I still have to scan the pages and color the cover. But it's done. All the back matter for it is done, and we're working on the scripting for issue 8 right now. So
we have a question from Corvus13 asking, which version of Morpheus, from Overture or otherwise, is your favorite?
Ooh. Huh.
Can I split that up into from Overture and then from otherwise?
Yeah, let's do that. So from Overture, I don't know why, but it sticks out in my head a lot. But there's this one scene in Overture where Morpheus, out in the desert, when he's sitting with the little girl, alien girl, are approached by a sentient hive of insects. And there's this one scene where his face turns into like this insect face. Still humanoid-ish, but like he becomes their Morpheus for that moment. Something about that I find really appealing. I don't know why that one always sticks out to me, or the one scene where Morpheus is sort of inside his own ruby jewel, and we get to see a couple of different versions of Morpheus. We get to see the crystalline looking Morpheus really well in that scene. I liked doing that one a lot. As far as past Morpheuses from previous Sandman, well, that's really tough. There's some really great, I mean, they're all great, but I think the two that stand out to me the most, I'll list them in preference. It's two of them. Preference, Mark Hempel.
Oh,
Mark Hempel's-
wow. Yeah. Kindly ones.
Yeah. Mark Hempel's Morpheus. Matter of fact, his art for that whole thing is utter genius. He's been posting old illustrations from that recently on Instagram, where he's showing the pencils and the final ink and colors.
Beautiful.
And it's like, God, it's so incredibly brilliant. And then followed by that is P. Craig Russell. So,
from number 50, Ramadan.
yeah.
Yeah.
But they're all fantastic. But those two always, like, I don't know.
I feel like,
and it's interesting because they're so different from each other.
yeah.
But both equally stylistically powerful and distinct, but I think the Hempel stuff, I mean, I look at that stuff and other things Hempel's done and no one else. Talking about a very particular singular voice. And I liked his almost poster art attitude towards the image,
Mark Hempel's one of those guys. When I read that when I was 20 years old, I was like, what is this artwork? I don't understand it and I don't get it. And I read it again a few years later and I'm like, this is just genius.
Yeah. And there's an artist that I would have loved to have seen their version of Morpheus based on how thought-provoking their style is, and that's Keith Giffen. That would have been super fascinating. Yeah.
Very cool. From Get That Ball, what did you think of the Sandman show compared to the comic source material?
I think they did a really good job. It evokes, adaptations are always a trick, because sometimes the decisions that are made, with shows that are adapting a book or a comic or whatever, there's times where you're like, oh, why'd they make that decision? Where you struggle with it. And other times, some adaptations, the changes or still hold the spirit of the material. And so the changes in the TV show versus the comic, the spirit is still there. They never once lose sight of the spirit of the original content. So whatever they altered fit, if that makes sense. Even some of the plot things that they change, some of the smaller plot decisions, that they change, it fits. And then one of the fun things for me was, one of the things that they changed that was fun purely for self-biased reasons, was when he's having his battle of imagination with Lucifer versus the comic version. The comic version is some demon, right? But in the show, it being Lucifer was super fascinating, and the fact that Morpheus wins by referencing something that is related to Overture, I thought was brilliant, because that doesn't happen in the comic.
What? What are you talking about?
People don't know what we're talking about. They'll have to read it and watch the show. But I felt like a lot of things, they just did a really good job with so many things on that show. But the only thing that I felt was unnecessary, but we'll see as it goes along, if we get a second, third season or whatever, is the decision to do Joanna Constantine. I felt like the way it's presented in the show, it almost didn't seem like it had to be there. They could have cut that.
Which Joanna Constantine?
Maybe they have bigger plans as they go that we're not aware of,
Which Joanna are you talking about? Modern Joanna or the 18th century Joanna?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It felt like, because I almost, at the end of it, I was almost like, well, they couldn't get John, and they came up with this, which is cool and fun, but does it actually enhance anything? And I felt like,
Even with the source material, though, it's kind of like, well, John is clearly here for sales.
True.
He doesn't need to be here at all.
So, but fortunately, because they decided to do Joanna Constantine, we got the plus of, what's the actress's name?
Jenna Coleman.
Jenna Coleman, that's right. She's so good. I like when I saw her from Doctor Who, she was so fantastic. So she just, really sings in the part on the show, even though it was something that I didn't expect to have, you know what I mean?
I have another question from Get That Ball, which is what was the experience like in creating a whole new heroine in Promethea with Alan Moore? I will actually expand on that because, as I've mentioned to you before, Tangent Green Lantern with James Robinson,
Yeah.
Hope Red Hood, Batwoman, even though you didn't do the first appearances of Batwoman in 52.
Yeah.
But you were the one who developed her. Like, you'd have created several new heroines in a day and
Yeah.
age where people are arguing about whether or not a young black actress should play a mermaid.
Oh my God.
How is well, what is it like creating bigger representation like that?
There's even Chase too. Like, I mean,
And Chase, yeah.
yeah. I mean, I dived into this whole idea early on. But for me, it wasn't about like, there was no political mindedness behind any of these decisions. It was just like, it's really peculiar because even when I was a kid, the fact that, Hope was created when I was a kid. And here I was, early teens boy creating this female adventure hero. I mean, at the time, I gave no thought to it. And I just thought she's an interesting character. And then when we went and did Chase, again, it was the same thing. It wasn't like, oh, this is going to shake things up. We're going to do this, rough and tumble detective female character. It was never thought about in those terms. It was just about wanting to write about characters that we found interesting. And as far as, I'm sure there's going to be some people out there like, yeah, but you're some old white male dude, to me, it's not about that. It's about writing characters that are different than myself. I'm interested in things that are not me. I have plenty of me. I don't need any more of that. I want to read and create things that are so different than myself. And that's where what energizes me. Now, the idea of representation being so important today is fantastic. But a lot of these decisions, I don't know how it is for other creators with some of their projects, but a lot of these decisions for me are never about the political angle of it. It's like, what is good for the story? What is going to make the most interesting story for me as a creator to want to tell? And 9 times out of 10 is, creating characters that are nothing like myself. I guess it kind of goes down to creating material that I would want to read as a reader.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to read material that's like myself either. So it's almost kind of a instinctual gut thing. It's never anything that I think about or I'd say, oh yeah, this has to be the message. You find the messages along the way while telling a good story, if that makes sense.
Specifically for Promethea, was a back and forth like that with Alan in order to create somebody like Sophie? So we can get back to Get That Ball specific question.
Sure.
Before I hijacked it.
I do tend to ramble on too. So
I was the one who hijacked it.
So with Promethea, at the early on aspects, I had no idea what to expect. There was a lot of talk about, it's going to be, this is Alan's way of trying to repurpose ideas he was going to have for the character Glory.
Yeah.
There was a lot of that discussion. I had no interest in that conversation that the fanship was having about that, or other people's ideas, what they thought it was going to be. I relied 100% on what Alan was saying it was going to be. there was also comparisons right away that, oh, it's his version of Wonder Woman.
Because Glory was his version of Wonder Woman.
Yeah,
So
I
it
guess
was-
so, huh?
yeah.
Yeah, that was an allegory in a way, but you know, and I could see that early on with Promethea, people maybe coming to that conclusion because, you know, Wonder Woman's based on old mythology, Promethea was based on old mythology. Yeah, there was those certain superficial things that can align between the two. But Alan never spoke of them in that way. He never said, "Oh, this is our version of Wonder Woman." It was never spoken that way. It was always about, I want to do a series that's about magic, but real magic, not Doctor Strange magic, more along the things that he was studying. So that was the discussion right from the get-go. And as far as, you know, being this Promethea becoming this super interesting archetypal female heroine, I don't know. I mean, Alan never talked about it as like, oh, this is you know, a political statement or whatever. I think it was more like he's creating this entire universe and needs to be populated by a wide variety of types of people. Of course, there's going to be there has to be a character that's like this in here. And then when it came down to creating Sophie and her friend Stacia, it was more like, how do we make them so different from each other? You know,
Yeah.
Sophie's the introvert, head in a book, likes art, all that kind of stuff. Stacio's like, hey, let's party. Where's the loud music? How kooky can I be today? That was fun to dive into. And of course, Alan tackled them the way I would hope any writer would. And what I try to do with my own writing is he tackled them as if they're real people.
Yeah.
So they have these different things that they get interested in or problems that they may have or whatever that come up along the way.
We have a question from More McGill 13. I feel like this is on a lot of people's minds. What are the similarities and differences working with Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman?
Okay. They both are geniuses, of course, as everyone knows. I'm not sure. Do they want to know the differences in their writing styles or the way they come at a story? I guess I'll
Probably
talk,
just the way you work with them.
yeah. So during the times of working on each of these projects, we all communicate a lot. So I would, speak to Alan a lot on the phone. Neil I would speak to on the phone, or we would exchange emails because emails obviously was the way that things evolved. Alan didn't do email.
You still have to fax him.
Yeah, all the scripts came by fax. Yeah. Yeah, long papers of fax. In terms of my engagement with them, my engagement was the same. I approached them the same way I would approach, say, working with my friend Dan when we were creating Chase. I just threw myself into it and my ideas. I'm not afraid to speak to either one of them, even though, like, at the time of doing Promethea, that was relatively early in my career, and the status difference was not the same, But as I went along, I was never afraid to talk to Alan and say, what about this? And that was key.
That's important, right?
Yeah. Right. It showed him that I want to engage with him creatively on the same plateau.
You're not just a hired hand.
Right.
Mick Gray calls you the director on that thing. He likens you guys to a film crew, and he says you were the director. Yeah.
I guess that's a good analogy. Particularly as an example of, so the script in Promethea would be saying whatever it's saying, going into this long description of this thing, and then Alan very often would say, but at the end of his long-winded description, that's always fun to read, But then he would go, but if you see it different, Jim, go for it. And would not want me to ask him about it. Like there was a couple times early in the process where I was like, when I'm still trying to feel my way and discover who I am in my career, early in the process of Promethea, where I'm like, oh, well, what about this idea or that idea? And so I would call him and say, hey, what about this? And he's like, it's you're the one drawing it, whatever you want to do. It was almost like, I've done my part. Now go do yours. If you want to, tweak something, he says, I trust that you're going to come up with the right decision. So it was like, in that regard, it's sort of like a script writer for film handing over their script to a director who then makes a final call on what that scene is and how it's presented. It's very similar.
What about Neil?
So with Neil was very much, in a lot of ways, he was extremely hands-off. He knows the story he wants to tell, just like Alan does. Where Alan's scripts are like, everything is like the cracks in the pavement are described, right? Neil is more like, kind of like wants you to understand the poetic emotionality of the scene. And so he's sort of like, he writes in a very lyrical way, I guess you could say, is what I would get from the scripts. And so, but at the same time, he, there might have been an instance or two, and I'm coming at it from two different perspectives now. So like Promethea was early in my career where I'm still trying to figure out what I can bring to the table. By the time Overture happens, I know what I can bring to the table. So it's a very different kind of dynamic and sense of confidence that I now have, to where, like I was saying, I got to a point where I didn't do thumbnails or any of that stuff. And I would just say, this is what it's going to be. This is what I'm going to do. And I remember having one conversation with Neil saying, well, what do you think of this? I want to do this. And he's like, we came to you for a reason. We trust you to do you, so in a lot of ways, he was very hands off. The only parts where we would kind of go back and forth on a collaborative level, besides him, like me giving him a list of things I want to draw, and he bats it back to me, hey, here's how I can put bugs in this scene, that kind of thing. Often he would want sort of to get my impression on a scene. Like there was one moment before, when I was waiting for some script pages from him, we got on the phone. This was so magical for me as a fan of Neil Gaiman. We got on the phone and he just wanted to read to me the scene that he wrote. And so I'm sitting there on the phone for 20 minutes listening to Neil read to me. And you've heard his voice, how he's got this warm, pleasing voice that just kind of carries you away,
I talked to him for 10 minutes and I freaked out. I'm talking to Neil Gaiman.
Yeah. And but it wasn't more, it was sort of like, hey, here's this cool thing I wrote, what I want to read it to you. He was excited and wanted to read it to me and get me interested in that way. But then there's other instances where they would leave, it was all hands off. I would do the things I would do, often taking 2 pages that he would write and turn them into a double page spread. A lot of that going on.
Oh, because he doesn't think in double page spreads.
Most of the time, no.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so a lot of that was left up to me. But they were fine with that because they understood what I was bringing to the table. Now, the parts where we would go back and forth, sometimes after I would draw, he would want to change dialogue in places, which I always find problematic. I always get like, I drew the scene with that dialogue that was there. And so I'm like, let's talk about that. What's that going to be? And so we would go back and forth on where placements would go. Because sometimes like to do the heavy design work aspects that I do, I always think about where the dialogue's going to go. Todd would letter it with that placement. That would go off to the editor, and then Neil would see it. But then Neil would go, oh, I want to tweak this here and now, because he wants to, for whatever reason, thinks that some other idea he has might be better. And so Shelley would message me back. He's saying he wants to do this. And she's like, where do you want to put that? So I'd be like, oh, well, maybe that could work here in this way. And then sometimes Neil will be like, well, I don't know if that works as well as this. And we would like go back and forth a little bit collaboratively that way after the art was done. It's pretty fascinating. Yeah.
Your co-writer
had to be the go-between. So she's like,
your co-writer on Echolands, W. Haden Blackman, is like a brother to you. So do you work with him the same way that that you would work with Alan and Neil? Or is there a much more collaborative, casual discussion going on over there?
It's pretty just as intensely collaborative, if not more so. Primarily because those other instances is like, hey, I have an idea for this, or a visual idea for that, or this and that. Here's an idea how I could think about, oh, this scene here at the end, what if we do this slightly differently than what is the way it's constructed? So I present that kind of interaction, where with Echolands being co-writer, we're both in the trenches before any art is done, coming up with that what it's going to be. But then after the fact, so we end up having a fully, completely written script, every detail in there that we want. And even though I was co-writer on that process of scripting and coming with dialogue and all that kind of stuff, I would write in, kind of treat it a little bit like with the Neil stuff, where I would put in, ideas for how the scene can look. But I would treat it the same. I would then, from the script, would treat that script the same way I would any other writer I worked with. And like, nope, that doesn't work anymore. And I'm going to do this because this will flow better, and make just those changes. So I'll be mean to my own writing sometimes in that regard on how the visual presentation can work. But I will say every writer I've worked with, it's been extremely collaborative.
What a resume of writers you've worked with too.
I know, it's astounding. Everyone has been extremely collaborative. Like when I worked with Grant on Seven Soldiers, for the last bookend, I remember having a sit down meeting with him at a bar in, I want to say, San Francisco. And he wanted to talk about the last book for Seven Soldiers, because he had all this stuff. And he's like, I've got 80 pages of stuff that I can only do in 40 or 42. He's like, let's talk about it. Maybe he wanted to see, come up at me with some ideas and me come at him with ideas to say, yeah, no, you can do it that way. So that was very collaborative in that regard. But we didn't get to speak much on the phone. But there was a lot of interaction in other ways. The person I had the least interaction with was Warren Ellis. For whatever reason, it was just like, it was just the way he did things. I don't know what that was, but every writer,
It's okay.
But every writer I've worked with, well, I guess James Robinson, I didn't get to interact with him that much at the time.
And now you're like really good friends, right?
Yeah, we're great friends. But that wasn't uncommon for, if an artist is coming on to do like one little issue here or a guest spot here, you're not going to get to collaborate, butt heads and get into the mind of that writer much, because you're just in and out, right? So that made sense. But, all my interactions with, like from Alan to Grant to Greg to Neil, they've all been extremely collaborative, and hopefully the work shows and it is better for it, and allowed us all to kind of like, no, we're all doing this together. So why shouldn't we communicate? Why shouldn't we like, hey, like on Batwoman, the first issues of Batwoman, Greg said, "Hey, I got this idea for this scene. What do you think of this?" I'm like, "Oh, that's cool. We could do it like this, you know." And then he would go, "Oh, that's interesting," and he would go write it and try to capture what we talked about on the phone, and then I would translate it from there. One great example of that is in the spread that you showed for her first appearance in Detective Comics, when we have all the setup of what her story is, who's around her, her background, and we have only 2 pages to show a fight sequence. And that was the spread you showed. And I'm like, so when we talked about that, I'm like, oh, how do
That
we
one.
do? Yes.
Yeah.
How do we make this 2-page sequence feel like it's, you know, as massive as, you know, 8 pages, you know, or the feeling of big action without having to show a bunch of different moments over a bunch of pages. So
Like,
that's the sort of thing where it's problem solving can come up in those collaborations by being able to talk. And that's the other thing I kind of like. It was that way a little bit when I worked with Leah Moore too, Leah and John Rapion
oh yeah,
on Wild Girl. It was like that too. Their scripts were extremely detailed.
very underrated, still uncollected.
Oh yeah, ridiculous. So like the little bits I got to contribute in Wild Girl was very much like I spoke to them on the phone at the beginning a few times. And sometimes some of these projects will start off where I speak to somebody on the phone at the beginning more than I do as we go along. And it's almost like, this sounds a little hoodoo-y, but I believe in metaphysics. And I feel like sometimes I need to get on the phone to get into a rapport with that person. And that allows me to start to do weird things where whatever the script is saying is find what's in between the lines that's not said. What is the scene about? What is it trying to say? What is the character feeling at that moment? What's going on? How do I bring that to the forefront and enhance that so it's more alive in the visual?
We are pretty much out of time, so I would like to end this with a signal boost. So More McGill 13 asks, who is your favorite comic book artists of the past 5 years?
Oh, past 5 years? I don't think I can answer that. There's so many good people.
You want to name 5 off the top of your head?
Oh my gosh. Well,
there's a lot of talent out there right now, guys.
There is
the point.
There is.
Yeah.
There is. There's certain people I pick up all the time. But when they say the last 5 years, do they mean that they've only been around for the last 5 years?
She doesn't say, or he doesn't say.
That's impossible. Oh my gosh. I don't think I can answer that.
I'll throw out someone I know we're both a big fan of.
Okay.
Dave Chisholm.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Dave Chisholm is fantastic.
And I'm only
Michael
saying
Fife.
that because I've got Enter the Blue open on my.
Oh yeah, that's great
now.
stuff.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Michael Fife. Like if we're going to start talking about artists that have that try to push the envelope of what to expect, yeah, Michael Fife for sure. Frank Avila is always, his stuff is always so alive, but he's been around longer than 5 years. So is Michael Fife, for that matter. Dave Chisholm has been around for more than 5 years, but
Yes,
people don't know it.
The people don't know it. Yeah, but so what kind of advice? So, you were talking about collaborating with people and the back and forth between a writer and an artist. And I think one of the biggest takeaway there, and we've spoken about this before, is that an artist is a co-author of the book. An artist is not a hired hand.
Correct.
So an artist is also the storyteller. So anyone who wants to give sole credit to the writer for the success of a book, I feel, is a fundamental misunderstanding of how comics works.
Absolutely correct. The writer and artist. Well, actually, I mean, let's be even more fair than that. So the writer, the artist, the colorist, or inker if there's an inker involved, and the letterer are all storytellers. The storytelling medium that they have chosen is comics. It is a collaborative effort to produce a final whole. And that final whole is the book that people hold in their hands and they read. Everyone involved is part of the authorship in some capacity. Everyone involved has made some sort of decision that affects what someone responds to. You know, great examples. Look, you know, compare, you know, what Todd Klein does as a letterer. You know, has a huge impact on the things that he does. What Dave Stewart does as a colorist has a huge impact on the final result of what he's working on. Everyone is part of the storytelling. So, but in terms of like the craftsmanship involved, the way comics have to be made, there is a pecking order in terms of the process of how it has to happen, the order of events, and that's, you know, a written story first in most cases, then it goes to the artist who, you know, has to make a lot of executive decisions about how to tell what that story is. And so the onus of the authorship is on that pairing, that component.
Yeah.
And then other creative decisions that come along or from a colorist or letterer are decisions that try to be in service of what the original vision is. But it's not like, you know, a choice that a colorist makes or a choice that a letterer makes is arbitrary. They're not just randomly doing things. They're thinking about what's in front of them. Therefore, that they have investment in the authorship in that way, you know. So
As can be seen from this one page of Echolands,
Yeah.
if it weren't for you, for Haden Blackman, for Dave Stewart, and for Todd Klein,
yeah,
this is not a whole page. This something would completely be missing. The color choices here, the lettering, even with the two people from Horror Hill having two different types of fonts,
yeah,
and so on and so forth. It's a whole thing. So credit where it is due.
yeah.
Thank you so much. J.H. Williams III, everyone. This has been the Philippine International Comics Festival. Visit us on the Comics Cube, youtube.com/the Comics Cube. We have issue by issue recaps of Echolands with J.H. Williams III as a playlist. And J.H. Williams III at J.H. Williams III on Twitter. And yeah, is there anything else you want to plug?
Not at the moment. I've got to, oh, well, I guess I could talk about briefly, yeah, the variant covers I've done for Detective Comics.
Oh, yeah. On
yeah.
Ram V's latest run, you're doing variant covers. You keep going back to
Yeah.
Batman.
Yeah, I got to do three for now. I didn't have time to do more. They want me to do more.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, it eats up a lot of time. But I did it because the editor, I had never worked with that editor before, or with Ram at all before either. But the editor, she's really good, sweet, you know, she makes it hard to say no. You know.
Yeah.
And it was kind of a fun little thing to do, just like a little, cleanse the palate, let's do this, you know.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today.